Welcome to the May 21st History Bites lecture, arranged by the Amherst History Society with help from our friends at Amherst Media. But today, our guest lecturer is Aaron Rubinstein, who is the new head of special collections at the Dubois Library. Aaron Rubinstein's title is the head of the Special Collections and University Archives, SCUA, also known as SCUA, at UMass Amherst. Aaron grew up in Amherst. He graduated from UMass, and he's worked at SCUA for over a decade. Before that, he was the archivist for digital collections at Tufts University. And before that, he was collections manager at the Yiddish Book Center. I would say you've got deep local roots. So we are waiting to hear your vision for special collections at the Dubois Library. Let's welcome Aaron Rubinstein.
Thank you, George. I really appreciate the opportunity to have an opportunity to talk to you all about the special collections at UMass Amherst. It is a topic that, for obvious reasons, I think is very close to my heart. And I do want to say that this talk is maybe a little bit different than the typical History Bites talk. So I'm not a scholar per se, and I'm not going to give a survey on a historical topic or share about my research scholarship. I'm really looking at this more as an opportunity to talk about the special collections and hopefully also create a bridge into this important, I might be biased in saying this, but this, I think truly important cultural resource in our local area. That being said, I think it's also important to give some brief context for SCUA's current philosophy and mission. This is a selective history, selective background about SCUA, and I'm going to inevitably overlook the contributions of many hardworking archivists and librarians who have been critically important to the development of SCUA over time. But what I'm choosing to focus on today are really the aspects of SCUA's history and campus history that have shaped SCUA as it exists today, and also what specifically inspires its future. I'm also trying to focus more on the interesting stuff, as my predecessor, Rob Cox, who I think many of you knew, like to say archivists are essentially just stock boys in an intellectual Kmart. So I'm not going to go into the details of how the sausage is made, as they say, but feel free to ask questions afterward if you have specific interest in the details of what we do as archivists in the special collections. So to get into the beginnings of SCUA, what is now UMass was originally founded in 1863 as a land-grant agricultural college, originally called the Massachusetts Agricultural College. The first students came in 1867, and at least to me of equal importance, the first rare books were donated to the college in 1868, so 1 year after the first students arrived. They were donated by Henry K. Oliver, who is an adjutant for the state of Massachusetts. He was also a mayor of Salem, Massachusetts. He was the superintendent of schools for Lawrence. And on top of all of that, he was also an avid beekeeper. So his first donation included 20 books on beekeeping. These books were books that were in practical use 100 years before he donated them. They are interesting because they bridge, I think, the gap beautifully between books that might have been rare and of historical interest for the university, but also books that connected directly to the university's mission as a land-grant institution, teaching practical skills, developing practical tools and approaches that can be shared, that could then be shared with the community, which is sort of the vision of the college and university extension program. And this sort of connection between the material and the collections and the university's mission is really kind of a central theme of what I'm going to talk about, and I think also really is displays how the special collections has developed over time. So about a decade later, the librarian Henry Hill Goodell authorized the permanent retention of college records in the 1880s. Then many years later, in 1931, the college officially established a college history collection. The 50s brought about an official room, now in what was called the Goodell Library. And at that point, the university archives were officially born. So what I have on my slide displayed here is a petition that was distributed by the first class of the Massachusetts Agricultural College in 1870 in protest of what was then a compulsory labor system. So the college was founded in 1863. The first students came 4 years later, and many of the buildings and the infrastructure for teaching agriculture and agricultural skills had not yet been built. So as part of the curriculum, sneakily, the college essentially forced students to do that essential labor. And by their junior year, the first class had had enough of it. They didn't see the academic relevance of doing that labor. They brought this petition to the president, William Smith Clark, at the time. And this was all described in a really kind of fascinating brief memoir by William Bowker, who was in that class and an eventual trustee of the college. Clark threw them out. He said, there's no way that I'm going to agree to that. You don't have control over how the college decides how it does its business. And the students in the first class of the college went on strike and refused to attend classes. And they had a significant amount of leverage because the viability of the university depended on this class actually graduating, right? Actually making it through and making it into the community to sort of demonstrate the benefit of a land grant institution like this one. So eventually they were able to overturn the compulsory labor system. They didn't totally benefit from it. It was really the next class, the class that came in after them, that were able to take advantage of the removal of compulsory labor. So the archives has traces that, you know, connect to many different aspects of campus life. So the next 20 years after the university archives really officially became a thing in the 1950s was focused on continuing to document the history of the university. It was a period that actually saw significant growth on campus, both in terms of the physical campus, but also in terms of the university student population, which tripled in the course of a decade from 1960 to 1970, essentially. So as the campus is growing, we're getting towards the 1970s, right, late 60s, early 70s. The campus, and I mean, this is true about college campuses all over the country, began to reflect the unrest that was occurring nationwide, both, you know, starting with the civil rights movement and then moving into protests against the Vietnam War. So these came to a head in two sort of major events on campus. There were many little ones that I'm not going to go into, but these are two that I think really stand out. The 1970 general strike on campus. So this was in reaction to the United States beginning a bombing campaign in Cambodia, which really indicated that the Vietnam War was going to continue for a long time, right? It was expanding the war and thus expanding the scope and making it difficult for the United States to see a clear way to pull out. So there were strikes and protests across the country. Kent State obviously is a notable one. There was on the university a fair amount of faculty, and even in some cases administrative support, and if not that, at least administrative tolerance. So while we were one of many campuses that experienced a strike, including teach-ins, we were one of the few campuses that didn't experience any violence during the period of the general strike. Also, at the same time, actually just a couple months earlier in the winter of that same year, racial issues on campus had come to a flashpoint. So In 1968, a committee was formed called the Committee for the Collegiate Education of Black Students, or SEBS, to begin to diversify the campus population, which had been primarily and in many cases completely white for decades up until that point. So SEBS was able to bring in the first sort of modern African-American students to campus. And these students, over the 2 years between 1968 and 1970, experienced a fairly unfriendly environment. And the various incidents that they experienced really came to a head in the winter of 1970. There was an argument of some kind between a white student and a black student around a parking space, although the details on this aren't completely clear. But it led to an altercation, and then fraternity students, a white fraternity, came and began threatening the African-American students. So Mills House was the headquarters of SEBS and a residential area that happened to have a lot of African-American students. So the African-American students who were being threatened by the white fraternity students barricaded themselves into Mills House and asked all of the white students to leave as a way of self-protection. And they occupied the building until a number of their demands were met. And on my slide, you can see some of their initial demands here being brought to William Field, the Dean of Students, and this is part of the William Field papers in the university archives. So this occupation only lasted a weekend. The demands, some of their basic demands were met rather quickly, but really it catalyzed plans that had begun several years earlier to develop a Black cultural center on campus, and also to found a Afro-Am department. Both of these ended up coming into fruition the next year when Randolph Bromry became chancellor. So Bromry, at this point, becomes a really critical figure in the development of the special collections and the development of campus. Bromry was a geologist who was hired by UMass in 1969. He was involved on his hiring in the Committee for the Collegiate Education of Black Students. He was very quickly given tenure and became the Associate Dean of Students. And that was the position he had in 1970 when all of the unrest on campus was going on. He then, in 1971, when Oswald Tippo retired, became the chancellor. So in addition to being involved in SEBS, and also for the founding of a Black Cultural Center, which became the new Africa House, which is what Mills House became, and also the founding of the Afro-Am department and bringing some of the most prominent scholars in African-American history and literature to campus. He also was responsible for the flowering of Black arts on campus, and in particular, bringing to campus musicians and artists who represented the Black arts movement to teach and do research and perform in the area. So people like Archie Shepp, Yusef Lateef, Max Roach, Fred Tillis, Nelson Stevens, Chinua Achebe, and then intellectuals like John Bracey, Bill Strickland, and the list goes on and on. And this really, with the diversifying of the campus and the radical growth of the population on campus, this, I think, really echoes, the sentiments on campus and also in the country at the time. In 1973, you had what's known as the radical package. So these are economics professors like Richard Wolff, Stephen Resnick, Samuel Bowles, Herb Gintis, all of whom essentially were hired as a package. The way Richard Wolff tells it is they asked him, and he said, "I'm not coming unless you hire these other people with me." And they, of course, agreed. These were all prominent, well-respected economic theorists. They were also historians of Marx and worked very heavily in Marxist and socialist economic theories. And so these changes on campus were also reflected in the special collections. So in 1973, so right in the middle of kind of all of this foment, all of this intellectual and cultural development on campus, the Dubois papers arrived to the special collections. And the papers arrived really in large part to the vision and connections of the Chancellor Randolph Brommery. And the arrival of the papers really began a transformation of the special collections from a university-focused collection into a collection that continued to focus on the university, but also expanded out more broadly, right? Looking more at national movements, at national figures, and looking beyond just the local region and just the university. So I think it's important to give a little bit of context of how Du Bois was seen in 1973 and how in a lot of ways actually bringing the Du Bois papers to UMass was a fairly radical act by Brommery. So at this point, Du Bois is commonly understood as one of the most important figures of the 20th century. But in the 1970s, he had almost been completely erased from history. He was a victim of the McCarthyism in the FBI in the 1950s. In 1950, he was the chair of the Peace Information Center. A lot of his activism at that point had moved into the international peace movement and the anti-nuclear movement. The FBI had been trying to find ways to bring Du Bois to trial for decades, really since the beginning of World War II, and had been unsuccessful. But the Peace Information Center was an opportunity because it was a foreign-funded organization. They needed him to register as a foreign agent, but he refused and the organization refused. And as a result, they brought him to trial as being an unregistered foreign agent. He was eventually acquitted, but they took away his passport, and it left a black mark that followed Du Bois really throughout the rest of his life, and also in many ways throughout his place in American history until very recently. You ask anyone in the 70s, 80s, 90s who Du Bois was, and they immediately say, oh, he was a communist, right? And that was the association of him. So seeing him as being an important intellectual whose legacy should be preserved was not something that was shared by every institution. One of the reasons why the papers came to the university is that Du Bois's literary executor and sort of intellectual apprentice, Herbert Apteker, brought a publication of the collected papers of Du Bois, collected correspondence of Du Bois to Harvard, and they rejected the offer because they didn't want to be associated with someone of Du Bois's political leaning. UMass Press in 1969 did accept that offer and published the collected correspondence of Du Bois. And Brommery also tells the story. So he had met Du Bois's widow, Shirley Graham Du Bois, while doing geological research in Africa and Egypt in particular, where she was living after Du Bois passed. And he brought Du Bois's widow, Shirley Graham, to the university. He brought her up to the 25th floor of the library where I'm sitting right now. And he looked west out of the window with her and said, if you look out this window and you look in a westerly direction, if those mountains weren't there, and if it wasn't for the curvature of the earth, you would be able to see Du Bois's childhood home of Great Barrington. So wouldn't it make sense to have his papers overlooking essentially Du Bois's childhood home? Brommery loved to tell that story. I don't know if it's true, but it is a beautiful story. And I think it really helped demonstrate to Shirley the connection that the university felt to Du Bois as a person and to his history. So what Dubois meant to Brommery and what Brommery saw Dubois meaning to the university, I think, was something that we're really only now beginning to understand just sort of how profound it was. And one of the discoveries that led to that was a document that was found in Brommery's papers by Philip Sinitier, who's a Dubois scholar who's currently working on a book that is really going to be the canonical narrative of Dubois's papers and also Dubois's legacy writ large. He found this document, which is titled "The Development of a Center for Intellectual Leadership at the University of Massachusetts." So this was written by Brommery a year after the Dubois papers arrived. And I'm just going to read the first paragraph to you here. So the University of Massachusetts at Amherst is currently involved in the establishment of a Center for Intellectual Leadership that will be built upon the ideas of great American philosophers. It is anticipated that this center will assist in generating a national renaissance of intellectualism that will strongly influence the development of public policy issues at both the national and local levels of our government. The center will be developed along the following two major lines of endeavor: the study of selected scholars in order to enhance and expand our great national reservoir of knowledge and intellectual thought, and two, subsequent consideration of these philosophies and basic axioms of past and current scholars in the development of social, economic, and political policies which will help shape our government. The impact of such a center should manifest itself in both the return of intellectual considerations into leadership decisions and planning, as well as the reestablishment of intellectual pursuits in our institutions of higher education as a fundamental and viable option for youth of all races. As a first step in the establishment of this center, the university has already acquired the collected works of one American scholar, W.E.B. Du Bois. So Brommery at this point in the 1970s is putting Du Bois in the context of great American scholars and seeing him not just as, a civil rights activist and a writer, and even a leader, but seeing him as a platform, right? As the first of what will be many collections that will create this kind of intellectual soup, right? That can be fed to students and also have an impact on the world around UMass, right? Not just on campus, not just on students. This is the tone of this really, I think, reflects the Watergate scandal. There's a lot of mention of the need for intellectualism in leadership and government, which I think is very relevant to that time. But I find this idea particularly inspiring at seeing how creating this environment of history, of scholars, of people and activists, how that can then impact the world around that collection. So this proposal doesn't really go anywhere. There's some seeds that are sort of developed through further conversations that will begin to sprout and really come to fruition a number of decades later. So over the next 30 years, the collections continue to grow, really, again, focusing primarily on the university archives, though local labor collections began to arrive and other regional treasures, as well as some other bigger national collections, specifically coming in through Brommery, like the Horseman Bond papers. And then the university archives and special collections finally merged in 1990, becoming sort of the department that it is now, the special collections and university archives. So 30 years after Brommery drafted this proposal for a Center for Intellectual Leadership, Robert Cox arrives as the head of SCUA, so in 2004. And here's a picture of Rob and the curator of collections who preceded him by a couple of years in 2009 in an article in the Daily Hampshire Gazette that's announcing the digitization of the complete Du Bois papers. And that project was started in 2009 when this picture was taken. So when Rob arrived, the way he likes to talk about it is he sat down with Danielle Kovacs, the curator of collections, they kind of looked at the collections that were currently there and thought about, okay, if we're going to grow, how are we going to grow? What are we going to focus on? What can we take advantage of? What are our current strengths? And the Dubois papers were the obvious first thing to look at. And what Rob and Danielle hit on was very similar to what Brommery hit on 30 years earlier. The idea that Dubois is more than just a starting point. Dubois is an inspiration, right? And in a way, he's an example. So the idea was to transform an aspect of the collecting of SCUA to become what Rob called it as an archive of social change, right? And this social change, this idea of social change, this concept is based on the life and the activities of Dubois. So if you look at Dubois, he spent he spanned a huge amount of time. He was born a couple of years after the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation, and he died literally the night of the March on Washington, the day before Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. So, he physically embodies a massive stretch of even just specifically civil rights, but also American history in general. And he evolved over time. He lived for so long and was active for so long. Civil rights for African Americans obviously was a huge focus of his, but also women's suffrage, the peace movement, Harlem Renaissance, and art and culture, economic justice, Pan-Africanism, and the list goes on and on. So looking at the way that he moved through different movements and also the way he talked about how those movements were intimately connected was really the inspiration for the development of what we call the Archive of Social Change. So we kind of boiled this platform, this infrastructure or idea down into two basic principles. So those principles are that movements and activists are fundamentally interconnected. And then this idea of whole lives, whole communities. So I'll break these down a little bit more. So this is taken from our collection policy on SCUA's website. The most fundamental issues in social justice are so deeply interconnected that no movement and no solution to social ills can succeed in isolation, right? So again, looking at Du Bois's life as a model, he knew that you couldn't talk about racial justice without talking about economic justice, right? These were intimately connected and had a profound impact on each other, right? And I mean, he saw those connections in many of the other movements he was involved in as well. This is true about almost every activist we've encountered, right? There really isn't, such a thing as a single issue activist, right? So these activists, they fight on multiple fronts. They understand how their movements and lives intersect, right? And this insight has really led us to build very rich collections that we find speak directly to each other. So how do we actually do this? We collect following the natural web of how activists and movements are connected. So, we'll talk to an activist, they'll, give their papers to us and they'll say, hey, if you're interested in what I'm doing, you should really talk to this person over here who I was really inspired by. And then this person over here who's involved in a movement that, the movement that I was involved in collaborated with around these two specific issues, right? So then we go talk to those people, they make other connections, and you can see this web grows out. And it has allowed us to build collections very, very quickly. And I just want to give a quick example of this. So here's a picture of Randy Keeler. Randy Keeler was, a longtime peace activist. He was involved in the War Resisters League in San Francisco. He ended up moving to Western Massachusetts. He founded the Trap Rock Peace Center here. And his collection was one of the earliest to be part of the Archive of Social Change in the early 2000s after Rob had This is Mark Sommer. Mark was a member of the Liberation News Service, whose papers we have. The connection to the Liberation News Service, so bear with me here, there's a lot of threads, but Mark Sommer's connection, so our connection to the Liberation News Service came from, again, in the early days of building out the archive of social change, of looking at the local intentional communities in Montague, in Southern Vermont, in Wendell. And one of the intentional communities in Montague was founded by a bunch of folks who had founded the Liberation News Service, which is essentially the Associated Press for the underground newspapers in the 60s. So we were connected to Mark through that group. His papers ended up coming to us. And then finally, Daniel Ellsberg, whose papers came to us 2 years ago. So Randy Keeler was giving a talk at the War Resisters International Conference in Swarthmore, Pennsylvania in 1969. Daniel Ellsberg happened to be attending that conference. And he heard Randy Keeler talk passionately about his willingness as a tax resistor to go to jail in order to not contribute to what he, to war, to the killing of other human beings. And seeing this commitment to the level of being willing to go to jail for his beliefs was, Ellsberg talks about it as being one of the most powerful moments of his own radicalization, of making it clear to him that it was possible for him to follow a moral imperative regardless of what the law said and what the expectations were for him in terms of being able to keep government secrets. Mark Sommer also moved to California and created a sustainable farm. And he, in his involvement in the environmental and peace movement, met Daniel Ellsberg and his wife, Patricia, and they all became very close friends. So in our initial talks with Daniel Ellsberg, we had already built up a community through even just working our way across the web of our local connections of important people in Ellsberg's life. And it was very clear that when his papers came to us, they would have very deep connections to other collections that we already had. Right. And I think this also demonstrates how our collections are not just stacks of paper, but really fundamentally about the people that the collections document. Right. And one profound thing that I've learned during, my previous year of acting head, and I've been head now in special collections for about 5 months, is that, what this is more than just sort of a group of related collections. It's actually a community of relationships, which I think adds richness and also opportunities for researchers and for students when they interact with that collection. I can explain a little bit more about what I mean by that in a second. So whole lives, whole communities. So rather than focus solely on a person's significant actions or ideas, our goal is to document the entire life and all its complexity. So what does that mean? So it's impossible, I think, to understand someone's activism without also understanding their personal experiences, right? Who they are. If you sort of look at your own life, it's clear you're not just a chronology of the things that you've done, right? We refer to this way of thinking about collecting as a holistic approach, but actually I feel like it's more an approach that recognizes the wholeness of people's experience, right? And so an example of what I mean by that, here's Paul Kahn. Paul was born with muscular dystrophy. He's an activist in the independent living movement. He was an editor of the important disability rights newsletter, Disability Issues. However, if we were to just look at Paul's activism, we would limit his legacy to not only his disability, but also very important, but still narrow aspect of his relationship to his disability, right? Paul had a very active, childhood. He's immensely creative. He's a painter and a playwright. And he also documented his everyday experiences, including his travel as someone who is confined to a wheelchair. So, looking at all of those aspects of who Paul was, help people understanding his motivations, his history, and the history of the movement that he was connected to, because it doesn't erase the full nature of who he was and how he thought as a person, right? So not only do these methods create collections that are in dialogue, but they also resonate with each other, right? They reflect the people the collections document, and that, as I said before, is really the fundamental priority of what we do. So using this approach, Rob and his team was able to build quickly and in a coherent and I think very powerful way. And this way of building collections actually brought SCUA in directions that I know Danielle and Rob were not able to predict back in 2004. We now have over 1,500 collections. So 75% of those collections arrived after 2004. So I mentioned Dubois and Bond, Ellsberg, Daniel Ellsberg papers, which came last year. We also have a number of drug policy collections, including the records of the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws, Lester Grinspoon. We have a number of disability rights collections. We actually just finished a digitization project where we scanned 35,000 objects from over 19 different disability rights collections. And among those are the papers of really critical activists like Judy Chamberlain, Elmer Bertels. I mentioned the anti-nuclear movement as a movement that actually had roots in Western Massachusetts and spread across the entire country. Organizations as far west as California, that Abalone Alliance, were influenced and modeled their activism on the Clamshell Alliance, which was developed in Western New England. We collect folk music coming out of New England. We have the papers of Tom Rush, Jim Kweskin, Betsy Siggins, who was one of the co-founders of Club 47 in Boston. We have the records of the New England Yearly Meeting of Quakers going back to the Quakers' first arrival in the 17th century up until the present day. Brother David Stendelrost, a pioneer in interfaith connecting Benedictine thought and theology with Zen Buddhism. Ted Allen, who coined the phrase white privilege. Ken Feinberg, Mark McCormick, and it goes on and on. So to zoom out for a quick second here, I've talked about the approach and I've talked about social change, but we actually collect among a few focused areas, right? So these are really the four main areas. So again, I mentioned social change, New England, UMass, obviously the University Archives is that circle, innovation and entrepreneurship, and these are all areas that have meaningful overlap, which is why we present them in a Venn diagram, right? And again, I think the story of the Dubois papers is a really nice way of illustrating how not only does there happen to be by chance overlap between, say, the university and social change, there's a very conscious connection and evolution between the history of the university and the development of our social change collecting area. And the same obviously can be said of New England life and culture, and innovation and entrepreneurship. As the university grows, so does its alumni and its connection to innovative and business ideas. And so all of this then becomes reflected in the work that we're doing in the special collections. So collecting is just one part of the continuum that we do as archivists. So there's no point in amassing all of this material if we aren't able to make it accessible. So just a quick rundown of some of the ways that we've tried to do this over the last few years. We have a very active digitization program with almost 270,000 items online and free. There's no paywall, there's no restrictions. You don't even have to log in to access our digitized collections. Still, with 270,000 items online, we've still only digitized about 1.1% of our total collection. So there's a lot of work to do. We'll probably never get to everything, but it's still important to be able to break down one of the most fundamental barriers to access, having to actually come physically on site to work with our collections. So we have over 100 classes visit us per year, both from the university and also from local grade schools. I mentioned photocopying here, which seems minor, but it's actually pretty critical. Almost all institutions, special collections institutions, charge for photocopying materials for researchers. We find that this creates a really huge barrier to access. So again, we've only digitized 1.1% of our collections. What about all of the other material that we have? And if people aren't able to get to us to view it, how do we get it in their hands? So photocopying or sort of easy, cheap scanning is a major way to do that. And if we don't charge, it means more people can benefit from those collections. We have hosted hundreds of events. We have fellowships that fund researchers to travel to Amherst again. So breaking down that barrier to physical access to the collections. And these are often early career academics who might not have the funds to be able to travel to do research during the summer. So we give them money to come, be on site at UMass for a month and work in our collections, and also to have conversations, right? To then not only discover the interconnections between our collections, but then also make those connections between each other as well. We have 2,300 research visits a year and almost 5,000 remote researchers, researchers who don't travel, but work with us to help them do their research and supply them with material. So we're supporting researchers across the globe. So I'm getting a little short on time. So I want to shift now quickly to the next steps, right? So what does all this mean? Where do we go from here? So to a large extent, what I've just described is my personal vision for the future of the department. I think this approach that Rob put into place 16 years ago is honestly just beginning to really bear the fruit that Rob envisioned it eventually being able to bear. The Daniel Ellsberg papers arriving was a huge step in that direction, but it was a step we had been building towards, and we're seeing this web expand even more rapidly than it ever has before. We're also, I would say, at another moment of transformation too, right? So the content of our collections has never felt more relevant. And we're starting to really gain this national reputation. Again, Ellsberg is a part of that, but one of the reasons why Ellsberg came to UMass was because of our national reputation. Our innovative resources and services are available to everyone, everywhere. We have really a momentum and an opportunity that I feel like in the special collections, we are in a great position to start taking advantage of. So I feel like what this means is that we need to acknowledge that we've been and need to continue to be more than just a special collections, right? But to become what I'm calling a research center. So, we really, and this is something we've done for many years, but we really want to break away from this idea of being just a collection, right? Just boxes on shelves that are prepared and delivered to scholars in our reading room. I mean, we do those things and we do them really well, but we also support all types of researchers. We're involved in the entire continuum of research with, special collections material. And, our mission really fundamentally is collecting, but also facilitating and encouraging dialogue, acting through our collections, right? And we want to see ourselves become a hub of activity, right? We want to encourage these conversations across disciplines, like I mentioned with the fellows. And we want researchers, also to have these conversations in academia and the general public, right? So not just in the ivory tower, but also in the community at large. And I think this, better than just a purely academic approach, really in many ways reflects the nature of our collections as well. So, so what are the first steps for realizing this vision? So we need to absolutely continue to democratize access to our collections. So that is, the traditional archival activities of digitization, but also finding creative ways to bring our collections and their content to diverse audiences, right? Thinking about our spaces, how do we make them more welcoming? I had a really interesting conversation with a good friend of the Special Collections recently, who said that his sort of vision for us in terms of a physical space was like a street level retail, like that you can just sort of walk in like a boutique, get a sense of what's there, feel engaged, but also know that it's just an entry point into maybe what's a much larger stock and more options, right? And that really struck my imagination that, being on the 25th floor in the center of a fairly hard to access university with parking and all of that, it's really essential to be able to find ways to welcome people and draw them in and give them opportunities to benefit from, I think the excitement of what we have as special collections. So, we need to, fundraising is a huge critical next step so we can build sustainable support for these programs, interns, visiting fellows, as I mentioned, acquisitions and also new projects. We need to invest in strategic partnerships. So I just want to give a quick example of this. So we're working with Irma McLaurin, who was a graduate student and a longtime administrator at the university, on something that we're calling the Black Feminist Archive. It's really a Black women's archive, but by collecting and bringing Black women's lives and stories into the historical record is really truly a feminist act, which is why Irma likes calling it a Black feminist archive, and that makes a lot of sense. But the idea of this collection is not to essentially have stuff go to UMass as a predominantly white institution and sit on the shelf like all of our other collections. It's to actually create a collection that is managed by the community that it documents, right? So having Irma and a set of community archivists work with the community of people that we want to document as part of this project, bringing their collections and allowing them to tell their stories, and also creating opportunities for students to both learn about and contribute to their own stories and histories, but also to bring archival expertise and a more diverse archival expertise into library schools, so it's possible for archival institutions to hire a more diverse staff, right? So that's just one example of the power of strategic partnerships. Even just this talk, I feel like is a very, very small, but still a step in our need to emphasize outreach and community engagement. We also need to continue to evolve our digital tools and services. This has become absolutely clear, something we always knew, but this has become absolutely clear during the pandemic. And it showed us that there's ways that we can connect with researchers and with classes all over the country and world using technology in ways that we hadn't even really imagined before. So, this will allow us to bring our services to, a full range of people, across the globe. So, again, this idea of community outreach and a street level retail space really, again, comes back down to this idea of welcoming entry points, figuring out ways that we can make our resources available for a diverse public. And, thinking about some of the, going back to the sort of radical package of economists who founded the Center for Popular Economics, looking at popular education tools for translating history and strategies of activism and social change into practical tools for contemporary archivists is really, I think, in a lot of ways, the next step. And community outreach is such a critical part of that. And I think it very neatly reaches back to the beginning of the university as a land grant institution and thinking about being able to make the opportunities and the resources that are being developed in the university available to the, the local and also the wider community. So thank you very much. I went on for a bit, but it looks like there's plenty of time for questions. So.
Okay, fascinating. Anyone who came into this lecture thinking that libraries were dusty collections of old books probably doesn't think so anymore. We do have, if people want to ask questions, we have space for questions. Either raise your hand, put it in the chat. We will try to see it. In the meantime, I was curious, when you talk about Dubois Library and it's an archive of social change, are there other archives of social change around the nation? How far do you have partners on all of this?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we have, lots of partners and lots of developing partnerships too with institutions that maybe collect a lot of different things, but have a particular focus on an area that we happen to have a lot of material of. So University of New Hampshire, for example, has a lot of material connected to the anti-nuclear movement in New Hampshire and the Seabrook occupation, the development of the Clamshell Alliance, and they're very natural partners because we have a lot of that material as well. So, I think part of outreach and also the evolution of digital tools is being able to make it easier for us to, and easier for researchers to make these connections with collections at other institutions. There's the Tamiment Library at New York University that focuses really on political radicalism, so communism, socialism in the United States. Labadie, the Joe Labadie Library in University of Michigan, which focuses on sort of the history of anarchism. So there's a few collections that look at social change and are kind of focused in that direction. But I think we're really the only one who takes the approach that we do, that looks at social change writ large and doesn't focus on specific movements, but is more interested in how those movements might interact and who are the people who are passionate about these various movements to the extent that they, dedicate their lives in some form or another in those movements.
Well, thank you. And yes, that's fascinating, your emphasis on not just sort of the headlines and the position papers, but the personalities, the people, the contexts. Other questions? We have a couple of comments. Great and so interesting talk from Renata. Sam Redmond says that his UMass students have benefited tremendously from the new classroom space and from Aaron's great expertise. Even though I visited the archives many times, I still learned a great amount from this talk. So thank you to Aaron from Sam.
Thank you.
Are there questions? Ludmilla, your hand is up.
Hi, Aaron. This was really a wonderful summary of the special collections approach. I know that even though there's only less than 2% in the digital collections, I have been poring over those, and it's really wonderful to have access to them. So my question is, how will you how can you engage greater, maybe you answered it already, just engaging more people in being interested in those collections enough so that by being interested, they will help you do the digitizing?
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, that's a good question. So, the digitization work is funded through a variety of different ways. So so I'm going to kind of back into answering your question a little bit. I'll start by talking about digitization, but we see digitization as such an important aspect of what we do that we make sure that we can always continue to do it in the background without any funds. So with the resources that we currently have, we're always digitizing. Many of the new collections that come in, we try and have at the beginning at least some small digital footprint, so people can get a sense of what's in that collection, with the hope of maybe expanding that as time goes on. However, external funds are often what drive our larger digitization projects. So the largest projects, so like the Dubois papers, or we've digitized the entire Horace Mann bond papers, the Visibility for Disability project, which I mentioned briefly earlier. All of these were funded by state and federal grants, large state and federal grant awards, which then allows us to really build up capacity. We could hire 50 students at a time to do the digitization. We can hire graduate students in library science programs to do the description work. And it's sort of fun when we do that, because we really create this fun, active environment. And we're able to bring in and give experience to a lot of students from different backgrounds, different sort of areas in their, different places in their educational path. So those are sort of the two main approaches for getting digitization done. We also get small gifts that allow us to digitize material from specific collections, so on and so forth. But, I think that what allows us, there's sort of a feedback loop, right? So what allows us to get these grants is, the work that we've already done with our collections in terms of making them accessible, and our ability to do outreach, our ability to make connections. This brings our collections up in higher esteem, and it makes us a much more attractive place to fund for projects like this. And then also, as we digitize material, so the disability rights material is a great example, we then bring in new audiences who didn't necessarily know that we had a significant collection on disability rights. So we've been collecting in this way for almost a decade. But until the digitization project, I really don't think there was a national understanding of what the resource was that we had. And then that brings in new opportunities for collections, new interest, and also new potential partnerships, which could then lead to more digital projects, right? So I like to kind of see it as a feedback loop. We were lucky enough, I think, with Dubois to kind of get that feedback loop started. It's hard for a lot of institutions to sort of get to that next step of, all right, we need money to do digitization, but we can't get the money because we haven't really digitized much stuff before, right? So, I think grant funding institutions need to sort of figure out how to help institutions get into that feedback loop. But we're lucky enough that we've been there for a while and can really, benefit from that kind of work. But I think there's still, a lot of work to do in terms of bringing in a much more sort of diverse public to our materials, right? We've done really well in academic environments, but we really need to engage directly, I think, with the communities that are actually more reflected in our collections than sort of the typical academic researcher.
Well, and I know that your digital collection portal serves as a retail store for your digital collections, and it's actually quite easy to use. So I'm really pleased about that, and hopefully we'll find a way to make it a physical store as well.
Yeah.
Thanks, Aaron.
Thank you. I appreciate that, Ludmilla. And I think also, that I'm glad you mentioned that, because I feel like I'm very proud of our digital collection site. I think it is very effective in what it does, but it's also very large. There are 270,000 objects in there. And I think unless you know what you're looking for or an experienced researcher, it's hard to find that entry point to get into that next step. And I think that's what I want to see. We've done digital exhibits of various kinds, but I'd really like to see us start to take a next step into creating more inviting digital environments to get people into that flow. And then when they go into the 270,000 objects, they know what they're looking for. They're like, oh, I see what this is. I want to learn more. And we recently created a site that reflects our partnerships around the Daniel Ellsberg papers, which is at umass.edu/Ellsberg. And I think that's sort of an example of a first step in that direction of trying to create, a very small step towards creating something in between an exhibit, but also an entry point into a larger world of a collection.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely.
Other questions or comments? Okay, well, perhaps, thank you very much, Aaron. Very inspiring talk. Anyway, so thank you for your time. And anyone who didn't know about the resource before knows about it now. And tell all your friends. Thank you for speaking with us, Aaron.